Welcome to the Constructed Awareness Podcast. In this first episode, Tyler Orr and Stephanie Levin talk about the origin story of constructed awareness. Welcome. This is the first episode of the Constructed Awareness Podcast. The podcast aims to disseminate information about constructed awareness, what we call CA for short, to get the word out about it. So this episode will focus on the origin story of CA. So how did it come to be? And I'll be your host today, as with every episode moving forward. At least that's the plan. My name's Tyler Orr. I'm the developer and creator of this model of psychotherapy called Constructed Awareness. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, licensed professional counselor, and work with adults focusing on trauma. So in this episode, Stephanie Levin is joining us to discuss the history of CA. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm really glad to be here. I'm a therapist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, working at Three Oaks Behavioral Health and Wellness. I've been fully licensed for just over 2 years. I work with adults. I'll do a lot of trauma work, life transitions, and grief, I would say, are my main issues that I work on with clients. And I became certified in constructed awareness last year.
Welcome. It's so good to have you. So we're going to talk about the creation of CA, but, I think it's good to know that, Stephanie, you weren't around for the development, at least in the early years of CA, though you've been around a lot for the new developments. Asked you to meet with me today to help me tell this story. So in some episodes, I'll be more of the interviewer, but sometimes, like today, I'll be more of the interviewee. So today I'd like to invite you to kind of guide the conversation. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Got lots of questions.
Good. Okay. So let's just talk about the origin story of CA. So where would you like to begin? Do you have any questions about how we got here?
Yeah. How would you describe CA to someone who's never heard of it, who's completely unfamiliar?
Well, constructed awareness is a comprehensive model of therapy. It's more than just an intervention or a theory, which we see a lot pop up as far as new innovations in the field. It's a model that incorporates theory, interventions, theories like personality theory, a theory called the theory of constructed emotion, which I'm sure we'll talk about in future podcasts. It has its own interventions. It's built around kind of a person-centered humanistic approach, and also has a mindfulness approach and different approaches that all come together to create this new model that we're promoting on this podcast, right? So the easiest way that I found to describe it is to talk about its three principles. Does that sound all right?
Sure.
Okay, so the first principle is if you bring awareness to something, it changes. So it's like, the simple example is you'll behave differently home alone than you would in front of other people, right?
Yeah.
Or like little kids will behave differently when they're being watched versus when they're not. So this is really the most important principle of CA, and it's the one that CA therapists really lean on. Because like traditional therapy focuses on using willpower, like hard work, to overcome different behaviors and emotions and thoughts. We don't, as CA therapists, right? So our job is to not try to change the experience. It's to deepen the client's awareness of their experience and allow that awareness to bring about the change that they're looking for. Mm-hmm. And the second principle, so what are we bringing awareness to? That takes us to the second one, that everything you've ever experienced is only made of three things. And we call these the three building blocks. They comprise your reality from moment to moment. And these building blocks are your thoughts, sensations, and external senses. So you have a mental building block, external building block, sensation building block.
All right. So is it okay if we kind of break these down and I can ask you some questions about it? So what led you to the first principle, the realization that awareness can be transformative?
Yeah, really just like seeing the result of trying so hard in session, because, you've done counseling school. They teach you usually like CBT, kind of more traditional way of doing therapy that I think is very like willpower driven. And when I was before I became a therapist, the reason I became a therapist because I was a client, and my therapist did more of this CBT, like cognitive therapy, and I did really well with that. But when I became a therapist, I learned those same skills that my therapist did, more like CBT, narrative sort of approaches. And, I would do everything I was taught to do. With my first few clients that I saw, I would do the treatment plan. We'd come up with goals. We'd come up with a plan. And the client, some clients would do great, but there were certain clients that would come in and they were like worse than they were before. Mm. They had the original problem, but now they're having all these thoughts of like, why am I not strong enough to complete the plan? It's like the ones that failed the plan. And I saw that happen over and over again, like just too many times where I was like, okay, there has to be a different way. And so that's what kind of led me on the journey that led to CA and to that principle. Like just along the way, I picked up a realization for myself that awareness itself is transformative. And oftentimes like trying to put pressure on or like white knuckle your way through an experience or a behavior or a thought, it actually just causes like a lot of resistance. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, it caused the problem to even like strengthen.
Right. Do you remember your first experience yourself with bringing awareness to experience, whether that was personally or, in the therapy room?
I don't remember the first time. And we're jumping ahead a little bit here with this, but like I remember the first time I had awareness of those three parts of my experience that we're going to talk about here in a bit. Like I worked at a halfway house. This was during my time, like my internship time, like pre-license period, of becoming a counselor. And there was a guy that lived there. It was all men in the house, and there was 10 beds, but there's usually about eight guys there. And there was one guy that was there for a while that we didn't get along, right? He didn't like me. I didn't like him. And I remember I walked into the room where he was and he said something hateful. And like, I do like this because that's how it felt. It's like there was this realization of like, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I see when I look at him. Here's what I feel in my body. And that awareness itself, it snapped me out of like an autopilot.
Yeah.
That I had been, all those like unconscious interactions I'd had with him where it's like he responds away and I respond away habitually. There was this awareness that happened, and that awareness created a moment that was where change was possible. Whereas it wasn't possible before because it was happening on an autopilot, on an unconscious way.
So what led you to discovering that there are these three building blocks? I mean, was it that moment, or like how did it develop from there into these three building blocks of awareness?
Yeah, and that's a good way to segue into the second principle too. Because the second principle is that reality is constructed by those three building blocks, and the building blocks are your thoughts, the sensations you feel inside your body, and your external senses. So everybody has a mental building block, a sensation building block, external building block. And those building blocks are always coming together to create our experiences, especially our emotional experiences. And they come together to create like each moment that we call now, right? They create our reality. And that realization, it started, well, there was a study that I read years ago. I actually first read about it in my master's program, and that kind of got me thinking. But it was only two building blocks at the time, but I'll get into that. So there was a study done in 1962. It's called the Schachter and Singer experiment, or the two-factor theory of emotion is what is what resulted from the study. But there were two researchers, Schachter and Singer, and they did an experiment that would be illegal today. And, like a lot of from the 50s and 60s were harmful. this wasn't really harmful. Like no one was physically harmed, but they lied to their participants. And you can't do that anymore. They have a thing called informed consent. So they told the participants they were going to give them vitamin shots, and they were going to monitor to see if they had any physiological reactions to the shots. But what they did was they gave them shots of adrenaline. So everybody had really big, intense physiological responses. Heart rate was up, respiration was up, they were sweating, flushed. And they put the participants in these small groups, and they planted what they call a stooge or a confederate, which is like a research term for actor, in each group. And some of the stooges acted angry, some acted happy. So Schachter and Singer went to each participant and said, what emotion are you feeling right now? And all the ones with the angry stooges said they felt angry. All the ones with the happy stooges said they felt happy. So they realized everyone's experiencing the same sensations, but everyone's interpreting their emotional experience differently based on what they think is happening. And so they came up with a theory of emotion called the two-factor theory of emotion, which was thoughts plus sensation equals emotion. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So originally, I was toying around with this idea that emotion is a thought and a sensation. And I started, was working with EMDR at the time, was doing a lot of that. I mean, that was the primary way that I did therapy for a long time. And I started to see that show up in the sessions because, are you trained in EMDR?
I am.
Okay. So those watching who aren't, it's a pretty simple therapy for the therapist to do, right? Because you do like this, the therapist does like this, the client follows with their eyes, follows the fingers with their eyes. And then the therapist says, what are you noticing now? And whatever the client says, you say, notice that. And you do that over and over and over again for pretty much the whole session. And I started to notice when I would say, what are you noticing now? Some people would answer with all thoughts. Right? It's just like they're using logic and reason to try to work through whatever the problem is or the memory that we're processing. And I noticed that when people did that, it was kind of it was tough sledding, right? It was just hard to make sense. A lot of times they would say they're okay if they're clearly not, but their mind was running the show. And I started to conceptualize the people who would do that as more mentally oriented. Mm-hmm. Meaning they rely more on their mind. And I noticed when they would tell me their history and their life story, what the stuff that's happening outside of sessions, that was showing up too. Right? It just seemed like they were minds kind of navigating the world. And then some people I would ask do this, what are you noticing now? It would be a real cathartic physical experience. It's like their bodies were running the show, running the process. And they would cry and they would emote and they would sometimes shake and they would move a whole lot more. And it just seemed like this physical experience. So I started to conceptualize those individuals as sensation oriented. And when they talked about their life, they talked, outside of session, it seemed that way too. It's like there were more bodies kind of moving through the world. And so at first that's kind of how I was conceptualizing. But then there was a group of people that didn't fit that I started to notice. I'd say, what are you noticing now? They seem to be focused outside of themselves. They would worry about everyone else, including me. Sometimes I'd say, what are you noticing now? And they'd say something like, well, I'm just afraid that you think I'm a bad person. Or I don't want to say what I want to say because it might make you uncomfortable. Or they would talk about anybody but themselves. Or they would focus a lot on things in the room or outside the room. I've heard clients say, say, what are you noticing now? And they'd say, that sound machine is just really bothering me. It's things outside. And so I started to think about individuals who tended to respond that way as externally oriented. And then when I went back to Schachter and Singer's experiment, I realized there is a huge external building block in the study that I think they just missed. The stooges.
Right.
They were the external influence that triggered and influenced the thoughts and the sensations. So I started to play around with a three-factor theory of emotion, right? For those three building blocks, your thoughts, sensations, and external senses. That all makes sense so far?
Absolutely. And I think that's really pivotal to your approach in this model.
Yeah. It provides a framework, I think, for therapy that I didn't have before. And to talk a little bit about EMDR, just to bring that up again. What I thought when I started to realize, okay, everyone seems to be more oriented to these different building blocks. I thought, well, what if I go back to the drawing board? Because, EMDR has 8 phases. And it's 3 through 7. That's the eye movement part. And it's like super structured and scripted. I mean, you literally follow a script and you say, what do you notice now? Notice that. And then phase 8 is scripted. But phases 1 and 2, which is called history taking and resourcing, or sometimes called preparation, there's like no script for that at all. Right? So I thought, what if I go back to the drawing board, right, and start over? Okay, figure out how's a client oriented, and which building block do they tend to rely on more than the others? And then so the problem was that everybody was answering, or most clients were answering from one part of their experience. So I say, what are you noticing now? They were answering from this limited perspective, and these other parts were less developed. So what happens if I figure out, okay, which building block do they rely on the most, but then focus resources, which is phase 2, on bringing awareness to bring up, to develop those underdeveloped building blocks, so that when I ask, what are you noticing now, could they answer from all parts of themselves? Like, would that change the EMDR processing? So that's what I did. I just started over with every client and sort of fumbled around and figured out ways to get that information that I was looking for, like how are they oriented? And then fumbled around figuring out what are resources that could bring awareness to those less developed parts. And once I figured it out and we were able to get there with clients, when we would resume the EMDR processing, the processing would be so much different. It'd be, so much more effective.
Yeah.
Right? Because like I said, I could ask, what are you noticing now? And they could answer from all parts of themselves. There weren't parts that could inform their experience they were cut off from.
Right. So then when you ask, what are you noticing now? You still left it as an open-ended question like that, but then they would refer to not just the mind, but maybe external or internal.
But eventually I started to play around with, what do you notice when you look at what's, the content of your mind? What do you notice in your body? What do you notice around you? Mm-hmm. Which was what sort of led to the development of the CA way of processing memories.
Wow. I didn't know that. I knew that this grew out of EMDR, but I have never heard you explain it quite that way before. That makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
Yeah. So speaking of that, is CA EMDR?
No. It was originally intended to be an advanced training because I was an EMDR trainer for a couple years. And I remember my very first training I taught on my own without I wasn't an assistant or a co-presenter. I was just the trainer. There's 6-day trainings. At the end of day 6 with 30 minutes left in the whole training, during Q&A time, somebody raised their hand and said, what's a resource? And I realized, I'd screwed up big time, right? They had missed a whole phase of EMDR. So I started really trying to pour on information about phases 1 and 2 from the EMDR model, from the EMDR perspective. And I found no matter how much I tried, no matter how much I talked about it, people were just always confused. What is a resource? What is what is history taking? What do you mean by that? How do we do it? And I wasn't having problems with it because I was doing what would become CA. So I was at a training in California and those questions were popping up. And I said, what if I came back and taught a training that provided structure for phases 1 and 2? Would anybody be interested in that? And the whole room just almost erupted, I was like, okay, maybe I'm on to something here. And so I went back and started to develop it as a training for EMDR. It was going to be an advanced training that supported phases 1 and 2. But along the way, it just turned into something else. It's just its own animal, right? Whenever I would hold it up against like the definition of EMDR and the tenets of EMDR, it just didn't fit anymore. Like the theories that began to unfold through that framework, I really felt like it was just its own thing, right? And I couldn't really find anything that was like it. I don't know that I haven't still. I don't know if you have.
No, no.
And it was around 2020 when it happened. And so EMDRIA was going through a lot of changes at the time, and like changes that were rapid. So it's like the requirements they had for trainings and for EMDR consulting and stuff like that. They were trying to figure out how to do it virtually because the whole world went virtual.
Right.
And because of that, it's like, it felt like every month the rules would change. And it was frustrating me. And I just kind of felt like maybe this is a good time to just walk away from EMDRIA and EMDR altogether, which was good. It definitely brought up some big challenges that I'm sure we'll talk about today. But yeah, so it's not EMDR. It came out of my work with EMDR, but definitely evolved into something that doesn't fit EMDR. It can fit with EMDR. Maybe that's something we can talk about, especially like EMDR practitioners who are listening, which I want to do a future podcast on.
Yeah, that's worthwhile. That's worthwhile for sure.
So even if like you're an EMDR therapist, but you're kind of struggling with like how to work with the phases 1 and 2 in a really effective way, maybe it's like you're just, sometimes you feel like you're sort of throwing resources against the wall and seeing what sticks, because that's kind of how it was for me. Like especially the level 1 training can really put a structure, a framework around phases 1 and 2 that can help prepare the client and therapist, right, for the EMDR processing. But if you wanted to take it a little step further and do a levels 2 and 3, you could learn the CA way of processing trauma.
Right.
We'll do an upsell about that later, I'm sure.
Tell me if I have this right. It sounds like where you started when you were first discovering this new way of doing EMDR, it was more of a technique, right? It was bringing in these 3 building blocks. But by the end, like after you had been implementing it that way, it became, when you said it became its own thing, it became more of a model of therapy. Is that right? Or
Absolutely.
Did that come later?
Yep. I think at first it was kind of a theory, right? And began to kind of theorize about the construction of experience, those 3 building blocks, which this is outside of CA, but the Schachter and Singer experiment is just an early example of what's now referred to as the theory of constructed emotion, which was developed by Lisa Feldman Barrett. Her book, How Emotions Are Made, is, I think, a must read for anybody. But the whole idea of that is emotions are constructed experience. They're constructed in the moment. They're not these like innate, hardwired things that are in our nervous system that are emotional experiences. They come together from like various parts that comprise our emotions in the moment. Well, constructed awareness kind of simplifies that because the theory of constructed emotion doesn't really explain what the components are, what the building blocks are. So we kind of simplify that and take it a little bit further, I think, where it's like, okay, well, we define what those building blocks are. It's thought, sensations, and external. And then I didn't really mention this, I've talked about it, but the third principle of CA is that people tend to be more oriented toward one particular building block in different situations, meaning they rely on one building block more than the other 2 in different situations. So like I'm mentally oriented. And so it's kind of like I was saying before, like I regulate myself with my mind. I connect with people with my mind in a more intellectual way is how I prefer. My wife, she's sensation oriented. So I've learned a lot about that reality from her.
Yeah.
So whereas I'm more of a mind moving through life, she's more of a body. And like, so she regulates herself through her body and through moving and crying. And, you know, if she's upset, it's common. She'll be like rolling around on the floor on a tennis ball or something. Like she's like using her body to try to regulate herself. And she tends to connect more through like touch and like sharing space. Mm-hmm. And my mom's a perfect example of an externally oriented person. So she lives outside of herself. Mm-hmm. She's always worried about other people, you know, so she regulates herself by regulating her environment and the people in the environment.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just imagining before you came upon this principle that everyone, you know, tends to gravitate toward one of these building blocks. I'm just wondering, like, what did you make of your wife rolling around on the floor before that?
It didn't make any sense to me. And like, especially like looking back to the early years of our partnership, especially when we would argue, it never made sense to me because like we would get upset with each other and I would want to just talk it to death. Like, let's figure this out. Like, let's make sense of this so we can move on. And it's like my mind would get really active. And it's like if you were a scientist like observing us during a fight back then, you probably would have noticed like my mind got real active, but my body got real still. Mm-hmm. Like my body would like almost kind of shut down in a way, but her mind would shut down, but her body would get really active. Like, you know, she's crying and she's moving and she's needing space and she's doing all this stuff. And there were times even when it would get so intense, like she just wouldn't even be able to talk. And I feel like a jerk now, but I'm like, back then I was like, you just use your words. Like, but we know now that her mental tends to be much lower than mine, you know, so. And well, you know, there's a whole typology of constructed awareness where you can put those building blocks in order, different combinations, and it creates 6 combinations. So that's the foundation of the CA typology of 6 orientation styles. There's a whole, that should be a whole nother podcast, but.
Yes, definitely.
So whereas I'm more like historically MES, mental external sensation, like, so the M is the most dominant, S is the most least used. My wife is more SEM, so sensation first, mental last, right? And so you can see it's like opposites attract, but it like really caused a lot of problems for us early on. But through realizing this and learning this, I've realized, okay, well, I'm historically very disconnected from my sensation building block and external. And so I put a lot of work into learning to connect with those, to be embodied, to actually be present in my external environment. And she's done a lot of work of learning to connect with her mind, right? And like learn how to communicate her feelings. And as a result, we've kind of learned to meet in the middle. We've learned to speak each other's languages. It's literally like we were living in 2 different realities.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, you could do a whole thing on couples therapy with that.
Yeah, that's on the agenda.
Okay.
Yeah, but one thing that's worth mentioning too is like at the beginning, like I said, when I was first noticing this, doing EMDR, it was very much like, oh, this is a mentally oriented person. This is a sensation oriented person. And I had some experience working with a couple different typologies. Especially like the more like Myers-Briggs kind of introvert extrovert. I had a little bit of experience with the Enneagram. I had worked with the Hakomi method, their typology. So I enjoyed working with typologies, but those are very like kind of old school, like this person is this type, this person is this type. And that's the way I approached it at first, but that's a big part, something you've been a big part of in this last year is changing away from like typing people.
Right.
More into understanding orientation as like a fluid experience where people's orientation styles, which is a term we're using now, they change, they ebb and flow based on different situations. You know, people tend, you might be one orientation when you're like in an environment that you're comfortable with. Maybe like when you're around like friends that you know, like love and care about you. But that orientation may change when you visit your family or when your boss walks in the room or something like that. So no one is one type. According to the CA model, orientation patterns are constantly changing. And that's, I think, even more useful now for a therapist to understand and to use CA. So you're not just typing somebody, you're helping the client understand their orientation patterns and how they change and flow through life.
So I think that understanding orientation patterns opens up conversations that can be really fruitful with clients about what early life experiences might have happened that led them to gravitate more to one building block over another.
Absolutely. I always kind of illustrate it, like imagine like little me standing in front of a table and there's like these 3 building blocks. Do you remember that story from trainings?
Yeah, no, it's very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. So those building blocks, there's a mental and there's an external and there's a sensation building block. And those are the tools that you use to regulate yourself in instances where you don't feel safe or connected and let's say that you're in a situation with a caregiver and you don't feel safe, you don't feel connected, you don't feel supported. You're going to turn to those blocks to kind of compensate. Right. And so let's say for me being more mentally oriented, a little quick backstory for me, I was born premature, really small my whole life until I was like 18, grew 8 inches after high school. And so growing up in a family of like really large men, like my great grandfather was 7 feet tall, like, and yeah, so it's like, and in the 80s when it was very like toxic masculinity, femininity. So it was, I think for me, like I was little, the external world seemed scary. My body didn't feel safe because that was the problem, right? I was so little. But let's say that there were times that I tried the external building block and I went into the external and it was scary. So I'm going to put that back on the table. That didn't help me feel more safe or more connected. Right. So let's say another time I'm with a caregiver and I don't feel safe. Well, let's say I tried sensation. I tried like expressing my feelings or whatever, and it didn't go well. But then one day I grabbed the mental and I was able to kind of retreat into my mind. Mm-hmm. It felt safer there. Didn't feel big and scary. Right. I could be anything I wanted in my mind. Right. And that felt better. So I didn't put it back down on the table. I held on to it. So next time I didn't feel safe, I didn't have to reach for anything. I already had something and I tried it again. So I keep trying it every time until eventually it's like morphed into the wiring of my system. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to think about it anymore. It's just what my nervous system does. Like I don't feel safe, boom, go into my mind. And it just becomes like my way of being.
Mm-hmm. And then in doing that, don't you become kind of more and more distant from the other building blocks naturally? Like, so maybe you have ways of disconnecting or shutting down from the body or emotions. Yeah,
that's
or
perfect.
The external. Yeah,
that's a perfect way to say it. Yeah, so it's almost like those other building blocks, maybe they were so unsafe or they felt so unsafe. It's like, well, I'm not going anywhere near those again.
Right.
And I remember when I realized this about the building blocks and the, being more mentally oriented, and I started to, for myself, explore connecting externally and somatically, it was kind of scary. Mm-hmm. It was, it was so foreign. Like I remember real clearly one time walking out of my bathroom into my living room, and I was there, like fully in the room, I was in my external, and it scared me. Like I was nervous, and my wife was sitting there, and I told her, I've never been here.
Wow.
She was like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no, like I'm present in this room right now. I've never done this before. If I've just lived in my head, it's like every experience was filtered through my mind and through my thoughts. And it's like, it kept me in this like small mental box. Does that make sense to say it that way? And yeah.
Absolutely. And so really what it does is just allow you choice, right? That you can stay in that mental box, or you can enter into your body or the external environment. Like, it really opens up choice of where your awareness goes.
And people don't know there's choice because they don't know that that's the only place that they're living.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
And once there's a knowing of that, and especially I see clients that kind of getting their first taste of connecting with these parts that they've been disconnected from, it just like everything starts to open up. Mm-hmm. You probably see that too. It's like these whole like worlds, these domains of life that they were disconnected from. Like, imagine me going my whole life in my head and never really accessing like the wisdom of my body. Mm-hmm. Or really being able to connect with someone like in an experiential way outside of myself, right? Those are the ingredients for empathy, I think.
Yeah.
Did I ever tell you, a professor told me once that I lacked empathy?
Yes, which is like so crazy to me.
In my master's program, yeah. And I was so pissed. And my school it was in Colorado, so I was there. Called Jenny, and was like my wife, and was just complaining. So upset. I can't believe the professor would say that. She's like, "Oh, that's so terrible. I'm so sorry." But then later on, I started to think about, well, wow, I'm really disconnected from my environment. It seems like that's necessary for empathy, to be able to meet someone where they are out here, and like disconnected from my own sensations. Well, that seems like a necessary part of empathy, to be able to, like, how do I have a sense of what someone else is feeling if I don't even know what I'm feeling?
Yes.
So I told Jennifer, I think maybe the professor was kind of right. And she was like, well, I didn't want to say anything at the time because you were really upset, but you could stand to have more empathy. And this was like, important lesson as a young therapist. And it was a pivotal moment to help me to start like thinking about moving away from that sort of willpower approach, because that's all it was very mental. My approach to therapy was like super mental, because that's all I knew. Mm-hmm. Which, like I said, worked great for mentally oriented people. It worked terrible for people who weren't. And so it's helped my marriage, but it's also helped me so much as a therapist to learn to be more externally oriented and be more sensation oriented, so I can meet clients where they are.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And would it be okay if we just talked a little bit more about how CA informs you as a therapist, not just like what it does for the client, but like when you have access to the fluctuation of these three building blocks? I mean, that must come into play in every session that you have with a client. Yourself, I mean.
So as a therapist?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think like what we were saying before about like as a mentally oriented therapist, my natural approach was to be mentally oriented. And I think that not only cut me off from parts of my experience, but it cut me off from understanding how other people might experience their lives. Right? It's like it was it almost brought like a real ableist sort of approach. That's kind of how I look at it, because like assuming that everyone experiences reality the same as me.
Right.
Right. And that's just like, then that's the way everyone should do therapy. Does that make sense? Is that answering your question?
Absolutely. And I've been through a similar experience. Like I when I came to CA, I was very much just living here. I was just a head going through the world.
You too, right? Okay.
Yeah. And when I discovered how to like, tune in to what my body was telling me and the wisdom of the external environment, it's a completely different experience of life for me. And so it absolutely affects every session I have with clients. Like it feels, this is the way I explain it to clients, is that I feel like I am seeing colors that have always existed, but like I've never seen them before. I didn't have the 64 Crayola crayons before, it was black and white. And now it's like I have all these choices of ways to see, ways to feel, ways to experience everything.
That's perfect. Yeah. And then you see clients having the same sort of realization or reaction or however we want to say it. But
yeah. And I don't think it's possible. This is one of the really cool things about CA to me, is that I don't think it's possible to guide a client to have fuller awareness of their experiences unless you are doing that yourself, which I think is what you were saying earlier. It's like if you're just mentally oriented, you're just going to stay mental with a mentally oriented client, and you're never going to go anywhere else, you know?
Yep.
So yeah, it's profound. I mean, it's a profound shift, I have found.
So I just want to be mindful of time for our podcast here. I think we're excited about talking about being CA therapists, and we could keep doing that. But I know that our topic of today is the origin of CA. So I guess I'm curious, would it be okay if we just kind of jump back to that? Do you have any other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
What challenges, if any, have you faced along the way, the CA journey?
So many. The biggest issue was starting something that's brand new. There's no research for it. Mm-hmm. That hands down been the problem that has manifested itself in various different ways. But because the EMDR, that had 25 years of research, well-established, evidence-based. So it was like the world was my oyster, right? Or whatever the phrase is, if I could get trainings anywhere. And so I had a network of larger practices that I went to and taught trainings at. And so when I started CA, I just reached out, hey, I'm doing this new thing. It's a new training, whole new thing, whole new model. And they were like, oh, this is so cool. We can't wait. Oh, is it evidence-based? I'm like, no, it's like a week old,
It's a baby.
Yeah, there's no evidence for it. And they're like, oh, sorry, we can't. We can only have evidence-based trainings. And so I realized, wow, okay, maybe I just made a huge mistake by moving away from EMDR, but maybe I'm just stubborn. That mental orientation really kicked in, and I was like, okay, we're just going to build evidence for it. I started out, there was a friend of mine, mentor, colleague, his name is Oliver McMahon, taught at a local school, graduate school. He was a counselor educator. Actually taught the research class at the program. And so I reached out to him and I was like, you want to do some research on this new idea? And it was like, he'd just been waiting for something like that, And so we started meeting, and, I didn't know anything about research. I always said for years that I embraced the art of therapy, not the science, but this has forced me to learn to love the science behind therapy. And so we did, the first study we did was a small randomized controlled trial comparing EMDR and CA, which was great. It was the first publication. It got us our foot in the door with the literature, and has really helped everything since. But there was only 30 participants, 15 in each group, which is small. I know that. But it was a big break for CA. So we have that study, and there's also a single case study that's been published where there was a client with complex PTSD and prolonged grief disorder. And at the end of the study, the client didn't meet criteria for either one. And the assessment, the scores, the measures that we took, aligned with that. And with the EMDR and CA study, it was really, really great. Both the CA group and the EMDR group had improvements, so both were effective, but CA was more effective. It actually beat EMDR at every measure, which was exciting. Now, I know that there was a small sample, but with that sample of 30 people, CA did exceptionally well. So we're cruising along. I'm in a PhD program now, learning research skills. We're gearing up for a big randomized controlled trial. We're in the works of planning, and it should happen. It looks like everything's falling into place, but a study where we're going to do EEGs with somebody who goes through CA therapy, so we can kind of see actual brain changes, which is great. So that's been a huge part of this journey, is establishing evidence. But another big problem with this is there is no, from what I'm learning, there are no guidelines. There are no hard criteria that exist to like standards. Like if you meet this level or you accomplish these things, you are evidence-based. It doesn't really exist. And so trying to get CE approval and stuff like that, 'cause people be like, it's not evidence-based. Okay, well, what do I need to do to be evidence-based? And everybody's like, well, we don't really know.
That's wild.
Yeah. So that's actually something I'm hoping to create some awareness around down the road, of the way the current system is set up in the social sciences and behavioral health, counseling, social work, psychology. It is set up in a way that prevents innovation. Mm-hmm. Right. And so there needs to be better standards that are like actually in the literature, instead of just, it seems like everybody has their own idea of what that is and they're kind of just making it up. I'd love to see in the future like more standards and more like flexibility for emerging approaches. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not just evidence-based or not evidence-based. And also, there's a problem because, a lot of people say for something to be evidence-based, there has to be a replication of a large study. There's a problem in science right now. It's called a replication crisis, where nobody wants to replicate. Everybody wants to do original research, and journals don't want to publish replication studies. They want to publish original research too. So it's really like set up in a way for somebody that's trying to do something new like me. That is the biggest problem right now. That's the biggest challenge I've faced, is the whole like evidence-based issue. But yeah, we're just doing everything we can to build enough evidence for it, where it can grow. But it's probably, I didn't realize this at the time, but it's probably a 10 or 15 year commitment to get to that point. Yeah. And then not knowing anyone who's done this. So if you're listening or watching this and you've created a model of therapy and it's evidence-based, you've taken it on that journey, can you please reach out to me? Because I sure could use some advice.
Call the number on your screen.
Yeah, call the number on your But yeah, that's been a big part of the challenge too, is just not knowing what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Like genuinely having no clue. Like somebody said, is it kind of like you've driven a car, but you've never like driven a car before? Like it's more like I'm driving a car, but I've never like seen a car.
Oh, wow.
Right. That's how I feel. It's like, so there, there is concern of like, am I going to take this in the wrong direction? Right. Because like, it's just, it's such an unknown thing, and it's been shocking to see how little is actually said about how to do this in the literature. Yeah.
Well, you could have fooled me, because you really seem like you know what the hell you're doing with all this.
I try. Well, and I just try to do what I can do, and usually that's what's right in front of me, and just trusting that things will work out, and it's not and it's definitely, I think, being mentally oriented. I'm not naturally patient. This has been 1 5-year-long lesson on patience, because nothing happens fast.
Right.
In the research world, the publication world, the CE world, and the counseling world, really. I mean, like, applying for a license takes months. So it's like nothing happens fast. And that's been a big part of my journey. But yeah, I think just the biggest challenge is like the lack of evidence for it. But it's emerging now. It's happening, and things are starting to roll. I have 4 papers under review right now, which is wild. I just realized that last night.
That's cool.
Yeah. So just doing everything I can. I've got a good team of people that's people that are showing up that want to help, that believe in CA. You're one of them. So thank you so much.
Are there other ways that you want to see constructed awareness evolve over the next few years?
Yeah. Grow. I mean, the big thing right now is like, I think there's been such a focus on like developing CA and creating the trainings and researching writing, trying to publish, that the next phase of CA, I think we have enough of a foundation, because that was my focus. Let's build the foundation so that it can grow. I think now we're moving into the phase where I'm looking for it to grow, right? I've been nurturing the seeds. Now it's time to sprout. And yeah, I mean, honestly, this podcast is a big part of that. It's like, how do we get the word out and, just tell people about it? Because people don't know about it. It's new. We tend to not trust things that are new. So, I think for me, it's just like talking about it more and like stepping out more, because it is, like I said, I'm used to living in that mental small world. So like a world where I'm just like creating things on my computer or writing papers, that feels very comfortable in that. So here I am. This is me stepping into the external world, to spread the word about what we're doing in this little great community that we've built. Yeah.
If you could return to the start of your CA journey, what advice would you give yourself?
I wouldn't tell myself not to do it. I mean, that was my first thought. Like, don't do it. It's too much
Go
work.
back.
Yeah. I would probably just let myself know like that it's going to be a lot longer of a journey than you think. Because like I said, I thought it would just be as easy, because like growing as like an EMDR trainer, easy. It really was. It was just like the opportunities were there. I had no idea that they would all go away, with it being something brand new, like, and not being evidence-based, and that there would be this much work, but I would tell myself it's worth it. This has been a difficult journey, but it's been wonderful, and like the people that I've met and the relationships I've built, the things I've learned about myself, even like what I'm capable of doing. I didn't know that was possible then. So I would tell myself, go for it. But slow down. Yeah. Slow down. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that you wish more people knew about CA?
Boy, that's a big question. Got any ideas?
I guess because my own understanding of constructed awareness has recently shifted, with this understanding it now as not a set of techniques, even though that you were saying it from the beginning, but it didn't really click for me until very recently, that this is really a model of therapy. I think that I would like for people to understand the implications of that more about constructed awareness. This is not just like little exercises, little techniques, little interventions. It is a comprehensive model.
And that's why the trainings are the way they are. Some people might look at it and be like, oh, like that seems like a lot of training, and because we're learning something new. I think a better way to answer the question would be not just what do I want people to know, but more like the specific people who would potentially be interested in CA. Because the people that we're hoping to attract to the CA community are the people who are in the community now. It's like therapists who really want to know themselves better, to not just enhance their clients' lives, but to enhance their own lives. Like people who are willing to take a personal journey.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to put it?
That's a great way of saying it. That's been my experience as well. That's absolutely.
For me anyway, I'll speak for me. It's just like the lens. It's not the lens that I see therapy through. It's the lens I see life through. I think you would say that.
Absolutely. Too. Embodied. That's the word. Right? Like just embodying it. Like, yeah.
So if this sounds interesting, and I think it really feels like we've just scratched the surface in this there's so many things you said are like the nonviolence and
the tuning.
Yeah. those are just big parts of it that we just can't get into in this one podcast. So if you're hearing this sounds interesting, check out constructedawareness.com. There's more information there. I plan to do these podcasts once a month, and I'll probably have a different person on, but I enjoyed this. I want to have you on more, Stephanie.
Sure.
But if it sounds interesting to you, check back in, stay tuned. Is that what they say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Watch this space, as Rachel Maddow says. Yeah.
Yeah. And reach out to me. You can find a contact on constructedawareness.com. I'd love to hear from you especially if you're therapists listening to this and you're just looking for something different. You've tried the traditional way of doing therapy. If you're anything like me, I've been trained to death. I've tried this, I've tried that, But if there's something about this that is landing, something about this that feels good, that's the invitation. Just reach out to me, reach out to the website. We're on Instagram, all the platforms. There's so much more to learn, and that's where I'm moving into in this stage of my life, is just passing on that information so that if there's anybody out there that wants to learn about it, they can.
Great.
So does this feel like a good place to stop today? We've covered a lot.
Yeah, I could talk to you all day, but I'm willing to stop here. Thank you so much for sharing all this.
Yeah, and we'll have you back on soon. I don't yet know what the topic is for next month, but we'll figure it out as we go.
All right. Glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.